right, so we are on journal 31. I do want to mention in this video and in the notes, this is only half of journal 31. I'm going to do a part 2 of journal 31 in the next video here. So what we're going to start off is figuring out what x is when you take the cube of it and get 216. So we need to figure out what x cubed would give you 216. So you can play with this in your calculator, like think of numbers that would multiply by itself 3 times. That would give you 216. And same thing with this, figure out a number x that when you multiply by itself gives you 1000. This one might be a little bit easier to do. So take a moment to try this out and figure out what x would be. All right, so with this one here, turns out x is equal to 6. Because if you take 6 and you cube it, that's like 6 times 6 times 6. Which if you multiply all of these 6's out, you get 216. If you don't believe me, grab your phone and multiply 6 3 times with each other. And then with this one here, the number that x would be is 10. If you take 10 and you cube it, that's like 10 times 10 times 10, you will get 1000. Now, what I had to do to get these answers was basically punch in some numbers and keep trying until I got this number. So this is a little bit tedious, and especially if I were to give you larger numbers, it becomes really strenuous to do. So we need better ways for solving. So let me just reflect us back to something that we are familiar with. So back when we were learning x squared, I asked you guys to solve for a square by trying to get rid of the square by taking a square root. You guys might remember that. So when you take a square root, it cancels out the 2 or the root, right? Bringing down the x, and then we would take the square root of 4 and get our answer. Now, I'm not going to take the square root of 4 here because that's not what I'm trying to find. Instead, the question is, if I had a cube, and I'm trying to find what's the x that makes this cube that gives it 216, well, what I would have to do is take the cube root. So a cube root will cancel out the power 3, bringing down the x. But anything you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So I have to cube root the other side. So I have to take the cube root of 216. And this part, you could build a factor tree and think about factors that 216 makes, that you would find numbers that are basically group them by 3's. So in this case, what I recommend doing is doing this part in the calculator. So you can actually take cube roots in the calculator. Basically what you would have to do is you have to hit the button math. So if you have a graphing calculator, you're going to hit the button math, and then you're going to hit option 4 in the calculator, and then you're going to get this icon, which is a cube root. Okay, and I'm going to show you using my graphing calculator. By the way, you can also do this on online. You could find like a cube root calculator and probably figure out what's the cube root of 216 as well if you're at home. So I'm going to switch this camera to my graphing calculator. All right, so on here's my graphing calculator. I'm going to clear this out. So you're going to hit the button math, which is right underneath the green button, or alpha, and this pops up on the screen. So what you need is option 4, where it has the cube root. And so you're going to press on the keyboard 4, and then this shows up on the screen. So now you can take the cube root of any number. So I'm going to put in 216, which is the number we were taking the cube root of. So there it is. I'm going to hit enter, and I get 6. I can also do this for the other problem. So if I go back to math, hit option 4. So I'm going to use the arrow key this time. There we go. And then I'm going to put in 1000. And then if I take the cube root of this, it's 10. So pretty easy. Just hit math, option 4, and then put in whatever number you're trying to take the cube root of. So I'll set this to the side. So that's it for the bell work. I wanted to show you that feature just in case you're having trouble with taking cube roots and you would like the calculator to do it. That's the way you could use those calculators for your advantage. All right, so let's move on to today's lesson. All right, so let me just say that in this slide is optional, but I thought I'd mention some old stuff that we've learned in the past that might be helpful when we're factoring, because we're going to be factoring today with cubes. But let's first factor with x squares. So notice here there are two terms, so this is what we call a binomial. And when we factor this, this one's a special case because 4 here is what we call a perfect square, meaning that when we take the square root of it, it is 2. So when we're thinking of factors of 4, we can do 2 and 2. So we're going to put down our x's and we'll put down our 2's. But because these two numbers usually multiply to give you this number, we have to think about the sign. So that's minus, right? So two numbers that give you a minus when you multiply, it needs to be a positive and a negative. Notice that when I take positive 2 and multiply by negative 2, I get a minus 4. But when I take positive 2 and add it with negative 2, I get 0, which is why there's not a middle term here. And this is not a trinomial. It's only two terms. So it's because the middle term canceled. So I've already factored this binomial. So just as a general rule, if you have an x squared and this number or the constant is a perfect square and there's a minus sign, then you can always factor where you would just split up, you would take the square root of this constant. And so in this case, it would just be an a. But one's going to be a plus sign, one's going to be a minus sign. So that's just the general rule. But let me just explain for a moment. So when you have the difference of square, this is what we call factorable. So this is factorable. Here's what's not factorable. So when you have the sum of squares, so like a problem where you have x squared plus a squared, this is the sum of squared. So let me use an example that makes a little bit more sense. Let's use x squared and then I'll use 4. So instead of a minus 4, I have a plus 4. And let's try to factor this because you'll notice something strange happens. So if I were to attempt to factor, I'd put down my x's. I know that two numbers multiply to give me 4 would be 2 and 2. And I notice it's a plus sign, so maybe I'll make both of these plus signs. So when I multiply, I get a positive 4. And so 2 times 2 does give me a positive 4. Here's the problem. 2 plus 2 gives you positive 4. And the thing is, you do not have a positive 4x in the middle. So when you multiply this out, you get a positive 4x plus 4. And that is not what's over here. So I cannot use this to factor. So what I have to do instead is what we learned later is that this is not factorable, so not factorable. And so what we do is when we're solving for x, we have to set it equal to 0, subtract the 4 over, and so x squared comes down. This becomes a negative 4. And now I would try to cancel out the square by taking a square root. So the 2 and the root cancel, giving x. But there is a negative, so that means I have an I. Taking the square root of 4, that's a 2. But if you take a square root, you have a positive and negative. So here's a big part here. When you solve for this x, notice it's an imaginary number. An imaginary number means that this was definitely not factorable because you can't factor things that are imaginary. So in that case, whenever you have a sum or a plus sign in the middle and you have like a binomial, you're probably not going to be able to factor that. Actually, you're never going to be able to factor that. You have to use the quadratic formula or something else to help you solve for it. So just as a fair warning. Now let's get into x cubed. All right, so here I have to factor this cubic expression. And so I have x to the third power minus 8. And here I have some formulas that are really important that will help us out. So in this case, I have one that works for cubes when you have a plus sign, and then another one when you have a cube and you have a minus sign. So to use this formula here, let's just go over a few things. So notice how this formula has two parentheses when you factor. So the first one is a binomial, and then this one here is a trinomial. So when you factor a cube, that is what we called a sum and difference cube. So one's adding, one's subtracting. They give you two parentheses, and one's a binomial, one's a trinomial. The first term in here is an a, then it's a b, then it's an a squared, a times b next, and then a b squared. And they're both the same for either one. The only difference is the signs. When this is a plus sign, this is a plus sign. When this is a minus sign, this is a minus sign. And after that, it's opposite. And the last one is both positive. So there's a way you can remember the signs using this acronym. So usually I can remember that it's a, then b, then a squared, a times b, then b squared. What I have a hard time remembering is the signs, and I use SOAP, this acronym, to remember the signs. So S represents same, O represents opposite, and AP represents always positive. And this is how I use it. If I know that this is a positive, then I know that this is a positive because the first one says same. So the first sign is same. Then the next one's opposite, opposite. And the third one's always positive. So that's how I can use SOAP to help me out. So like if I was working this problem, I know I'm going to have two parentheses. One's a binomial, one's a trinomial. Because this is a minus sign, I know that this first sign is going to be the same. Then it's going to be opposite, and then the third one is going to be always positive. So I have my signs down, not even using the formula. The thing I still need to know is like what goes into each compartment. So first start off with figuring out what's your A, what's your B. So A here looks like it's my, so let me use different, yeah. So it looks like A here is your X, and it's being cubed. And so I know my A here is X. And then I have an 8 that was already cubed. So if I were to take the cube root of 8, that would give me, so the cube root of 8 is 2. And so I know that this here should have been a 2. And that's my B. So notice that 2 to the third power would also give you an 8. And so when I use this formula, I'm going to plug it in. So this is going to be an X. This is going to be a 2. And that's just because, you know, my A goes here and then my B. So I just had to ask myself, what is A? What is B? And then afterwards, notice that it's A squared. So I need my A squared to go here. So I'm going to write above what I'm putting in. So this is my A. This is my B. I should have A squared next, and then A times B, and then B squared. So my A squared is my X, and if I square it, I get X squared. My A and my B is these two, so if I multiply them, X times 2 gives me 2X. And then my B squared is 2 squared, so that's going to be 4. And so it looks like this here is my factor. And I am done. So all I had to do was factor, and these are my two factors. Let me just explain for a moment that some people, when they see this part, the trinomial, they try to factor this more. But I'm going to tell you right now, do not waste your time trying to factor this one. Because when you use this formula, this here is not factorable. Okay, it's never factorable. So let me just reiterate this part. The trinomial is not factorable. So do not try to factor this, as tempting as it is. Okay, let's move on to the next problem here. So here I have one that has a 64 in front of the x cubed. So we'll figure out how to deal with this one. This one has a plus sign. So when you're dealing with this problem and using the formula, we're going to have to consider that this one is a plus. So I'm going to use my SOAP acronym to help me out. So SOAP, same, opposite, always positive. So because this is a positive, the next one's going to be the same. So it's positive, then it's opposite, and then always positive. And so from here, I need to figure out what my a is. So remember, it's always a and then b and then a squared. A times b and then b squared. So in this case, my a here, I have to think about. So I'm going to put my compartment. So this is going to be a, this is going to be b. So if I were to just think about the x is being cubed here, so I know x has to be inside, so x is part of a. And then what's the cube root of 64? So cube root of 64. So you can try that in the calculator, but basically you're asking yourself what number multiplied 3 times would give you 64, and it's 4. So 4 times 4 times 4, or 4 cubed, would give you 64. So I know when I cube this, I have to cube the 4 and the x, giving me 64x cubed. Now, the cube root of 1 is pretty easy. It's just 1. So I know my a here is 4x. My b here is 1. And then this is going to be a squared, so I need to take my 4x and square it. So if I square 4, I get 16. If I square x, I get x squared. And then I have to multiply my a with my b. 4x times 1 gives me 4x. And then 1 squared, or my b squared, is going to be 1. And so now it looks like I have already factored. And like I said before, this trinomial here is not factorable, so don't try to factor this. All right, so let's do some homework problems from packet 7 on page 1. So here I have some problems for us. So this one here is from page 1, and it's number 3, and there's a 27x cubed plus 8 that we need to factor. So up above, I've already put the formula for the positive, since both of these problems have a positive. So I'm going to make my factors, so my binomial and trinomial. So this is a plus sign, so I need a positive, the same, opposite, and then always positive. And so looking at this, let's figure out our a and our b. So it looks like a here, I need an x. And then the cube root of 27 is 3. So that means my a here is 3x. So that's going to be my a. My b here is the cube root of 8, which is 2. So this needs to be a 2. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to write a here. Should have been an x. My bad. So I have a 3x and then a 2. And then in this compartment, I have my a squared. So if I take 3x and square it, if I square 3, I get a 9. If I square x, I get an x squared. And then to get the middle term, if I multiply my a with my b, a times b gives you 6x. And then if I take my b, which is 2, if I square b, that's going to give me a 4. 2 squared gives me 4. And that's it. That's my factor. All right, and then we have our last one here. So this one, again, is a plus sign. So I'm going to create my parentheses first and put in my signs. So because this is a plus sign, this is going to be the same, opposite, and always positive. And so starting off, let's figure out what a is. So a is going to be, looks like x, and the cube root of 8 is 2. And then 1, take the cube root of 1 is going to be just 1. And so my a here is 2x, my b is 1. So I'm going to put a 2x here, a 1 here, and then it's your a squared, So this is going to be 4x squared if I square my a. And then the middle term is a times b, so 2x times 1 gives you 2x. And last but not least, it's your b squared at the very end, so 1 squared is just a 1. And there we have it, our factors. And that's it for today. So try out the other two problems, 1 and 2, on your own. And then we'll do the journal 31 part 2 next time.